The last thing I remember clearly is the searing pain. One minute, I was standing on a stool in my kitchen, trying to reach a box on the top shelf, and the next, I slipped. My head hit the corner of the counter hard, and everything went black. When I woke up, my head throbbed with an intensity that made me feel sick. The air around me was cold, damp, and smelled of mildew. I opened my eyes slowly, struggling to focus, but nothing looked familiar. I wasn't in my kitchen. I wasn't even in my house. I was lying on a rough concrete floor, surrounded by dark stone walls. The dim light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered weakly. My heart began to race as I tried to sit up, my head spinning. It was a basement, but not mine. The walls were made of old, crumbling stone, and the air felt oppressive, heavy. I pushed myself to my feet, using the wall for support, my legs shaky. My head pounded, and when I touched the side of my skull, I winced. My fingers came away slick with dried blood. I forced myself to take deep breaths, to stay calm, but panic clawed at the edges of my mind. How had I ended up here? My house didn't have a basement, and I was certain I hadn't left. Someone must have moved me, dragged me here while I was unconscious. The thought made my stomach turn. I scanned the room, desperate for some sign of where I was. There were no windows, just the cold stone walls closing in on all sides. A heavy wooden door stood at the far end of the room. I stumbled toward it, grabbing the handle and pulling with all my strength. It didn't budge. I tried again, this time pushing, but the door remained firmly shut. I pressed my ear against it, hoping to hear something, anything, but there was only silence. My heart sank. I was trapped. I banged on the door with my fists, calling out, but my voice echoed back at me, hollow and lonely. I tried again, but there was no response. Whoever had put me here wasn't going to let me out easily. I stepped back from the door, feeling the panic start to rise again. I needed to find another way out. I searched the walls, feeling for any cracks or gaps, but they were solid stone. My only source of light, the dim bulb overhead, flickered again, casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. As I paced, trying to think, I heard it, a faint noise, like something moving above me. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening. There it was again, a soft shuffling, like someone or something was walking around upstairs. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is anyone there?" No answer. But the noise continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was circling above me. The floorboards above my head creaked and I felt my skin prickle with fear. I wasn't alone. Someone was up there. Someone who had put me here. I pounded on the door again, harder this time. "Let me out!" The noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with dread. I stood there, my breath coming in short gasps, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, slowly, the creaking started again, this time moving away, deeper into the cabin or house or whatever it was. I didn't know where I was, but the person or thing above me did. I turned my attention back to the room, trying to think rationally. There had to be another way out. I couldn't just wait here for whoever or whatever was upstairs to come back. I searched every corner of the basement, my hands running over the rough stone walls, but there was nothing. No hidden doors, no weak spots, nothing but cold stone trapping me inside. I returned to the door, pushing and pulling with all my strength, but it wouldn't give. I was about to give up when I noticed something, a small metal grate, barely noticeable in the floor near the corner of the room. It was a ventilation shaft, maybe just big enough for me to crawl through. I knelt down, pulling at the grate. It was rusted and loose, and after a few hard tugs, it came free. I peered into the dark tunnel beyond, the air inside stale and thick. It wasn't exactly a great option, but it was the only one I had. I took a deep breath and started to crawl into the vent. It was tight, the rough metal scraping against my skin, and the deeper I went, the darker it got. I kept moving, hoping the tunnel would lead to some kind of exit. But after what felt like an eternity, the tunnel came to an abrupt end, a dead end. Frustration and fear overwhelmed me, and I kicked at the walls of the vent, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was trapped. Again. That's when I heard the noise. Faint at first, then growing louder. The sound of something scraping along the walls of the tunnel, coming from behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was getting closer, the scraping sound echoing through the narrow space. I scrambled to turn around, but the vent was too tight. Whatever was coming toward me was moving fast, faster than I could react. I had no choice but to backpedal, dragging myself out of the vent as quickly as I could, the sound growing louder with every passing second. I reached the basement floor just as something cold and sharp brushed against my ankle. I kicked wildly, pulling myself free, and scrambled to my feet, slamming the grate back into place. The noise stopped and the basement fell into silence once more. I backed away from the grate, my whole body shaking. Whatever was down there, it was trapped, at least for now. But I was still stuck in the basement with no way out. The creaking upstairs started again. This time it was accompanied by something else, a voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. "David?" I whispered, my throat tight with disbelief. David had been my friend. He'd been dead for years. I hadn't thought about him in a long time. But the voice, it sounded just like him. The floorboards above creaked louder, and the voice came again, clearer this time. "Come upstairs," it said, soft and inviting. I took a step toward the door, my mind racing. David couldn't be alive. He had died. I had gone to his funeral. But the voice, it was him. It had to be. I didn't know what to believe anymore. My head pounded, the pain from the fall making it hard to think clearly. The light overhead flickered again, and in that moment, I made the decision. I reached for the door handle, and this time it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading up into the darkness. The voice, David's voice, beckoned again, and I stepped forward, my legs trembling with fear. As I climbed the stairs, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift and stretch around me. The voice called out one last time, soft and distant, and I felt a cold presence at my back, pushing me forward. I reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the darkness beyond. The door slammed shut behind me, and then there was only silence. The storm hit faster than I expected. One minute, the sky was overcast but calm, and the next, thunder cracked the air, followed by sheets of rain that pounded the forest relentlessly. I had been hiking alone, foolishly ignoring the weather warnings, and now I was miles from my car, lost somewhere deep in the woods. The path I'd been following had dissolved into a mess of mud and fallen branches. I needed to find shelter, and fast. That's when I saw it. Through the dense trees and the driving rain, I spotted what looked like the outline of a cabin. I couldn't believe my luck. I pushed through the undergrowth, slipping and stumbling, until I reached it. The cabin was old, its wooden walls weathered and dark, the roof sagging in places. But it was shelter. I hesitated briefly, feeling an odd prickling at the back of my neck. Something about the place felt wrong. But the storm showed no signs of letting up, and the cold rain was already soaking through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. I knocked on the door, just in case. No response. The wind howled around me, and a blast of lightning illuminated the sky. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was stale, thick with dust and decay. The floorboards creaked underfoot as I moved cautiously through the dimly lit space. It wasn't much, just a single room with a small table, a few old chairs, and a fireplace filled with cold, crumbling ashes. The walls were lined with shelves, cluttered with jars and old trinkets that had clearly been there for years, untouched. I closed the door behind me, grateful for the respite from the storm. The wind rattled the windows, but at least I was out of the rain. I set my pack down and shook off the water, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The cabin felt abandoned, but there was something strange about the way everything was left in place, as if the owner had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. I tried not to think too much about it. There was a small bed in the corner, covered with a dusty blanket. It looked more inviting than the cold floor, so I sat down, hoping to wait out the worst of the storm. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked ominously. I felt isolated, cut off from the world, surrounded by nothing but miles of forest and darkness. That's when I noticed something, a smell. Faint at first, but unmistakable. A rotting, sour odor, like something had died and been left to decay. I wrinkled my nose and stood up, scanning the room for the source. My eyes fell on the large wardrobe against the far wall. It was old, the wood cracked and splintered, the doors slightly ajar. The smell seemed to be coming from there. I hesitated. Every instinct told me not to open it, but something compelled me to see what was inside. Slowly, I approached the wardrobe, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached out, gripping the edge of the door, and pulled it open. At first, I didn't see anything, just old clothes, yellowed with age, hanging limply from wire hangers. But then, tucked away at the bottom, I saw it, a small, bundled shape. It was wrapped in dirty, stained cloth, the source of the foul smell. My stomach churned as I knelt down, leaning in closer. I reached out and carefully pulled back the cloth. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was a doll. No, more than that. It was some crude, handmade figure, its face sewn from rough fabric, its eyes buttons that had been sewn on crookedly. Its body was stuffed with what looked like straw, but the arms and legs were twisted in unnatural ways, as if someone had deliberately contorted them. The cloth that wrapped it was stained dark, with what I could only hope wasn't blood. I dropped it, stumbling back in horror. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to steady myself. What was this thing? And why was it here, hidden away like that? I turned, desperate to leave the cabin, but something stopped me cold. There was a noise, a soft, shuffling sound. I froze, listening. It was coming from outside. The cabin's front door creaked, as if someone or something was pressing against it from the outside. The wind had died down and the storm had quieted, but now a different kind of tension filled the air. Slowly, I backed away from the door, my eyes locked on the handle, which rattled slightly, as if being tested. I grabbed a heavy fire iron from the fireplace, gripping it tightly. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear anything else. The handle rattled again, harder this time, and the door creaked open, just an inch. I didn't move. I couldn't. The door swung open wider, and standing there in the doorway, half obscured by shadow, was a figure. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She was tall and thin, her skin pale and her hair long and stringy, hanging in front of her face like a veil. Her clothes were tattered, soaked from the rain, but I could see that she wasn't wet. Not anymore. She stood still, just outside the doorway, her head tilted to one side as if she were listening for something. I stepped back, trying to stay silent, but the floor creaked beneath my weight. The woman's head snapped in my direction, and I saw her eyes. They were wide and staring, unfocused, as if she couldn't see me, but knew exactly where I was. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. I stepped back again, my grip tightening on the fire iron. The woman stepped forward, one foot crossing the threshold of the cabin. I could hear her breathing now, slow, ragged breaths, like she was struggling to draw air. Then, without warning, she lunged forward. I swung the fire iron, connecting with her arm. She didn't scream, didn't even flinch. Instead, she reached out with impossibly cold hands and grabbed my wrist, her grip like ice. I tried to pull away, but she was stronger than she looked. Her nails dug into my skin, and I felt a sharp, burning pain as her other hand moved toward my throat. Desperation took over, and I swung again, this time hitting her square in the chest. She staggered back, her grip loosening, and I seized the chance to run. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting into the night. The rain had stopped, but the forest was still shrouded in mist. I ran blindly through the trees, branches whipping at my face, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear her behind me, her footsteps soft but relentless, growing closer with every passing second. I didn't know how long I ran. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out. Finally, I stumbled, collapsing against a tree, gasping for air. I listened, waiting for her to appear, but all I heard was the eerie silence of the forest. I waited, too scared to move, until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. I never saw her again. I left the woods that day and never went back. But I can still feel her presence, still hear her breathing in the dead of night, and I know, whatever that thing was, it's still out there, waiting. When my grandmother passed away, the task of clearing out her old cabin in the woods fell to me. No one in the family wanted anything to do with the place. It had been abandoned for years, ever since she moved into the nursing home, and I hadn't been there since I was a child. The thought of spending time alone in that cabin filled me with a strange unease, but it had to be done. The cabin sat deep in the forest, far from any neighbors or roads. As I drove the winding path, The trees seemed to grow denser, their branches weaving together above me, blocking out the sky. I remembered visiting my grandmother there during summers when I was young, but those memories felt distant now, faded images of a time when the woods had seemed enchanting instead of foreboding. I arrived just before dusk, the cabin standing silent and dark, its windows grimy with years of neglect. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. I climbed the porch steps and fumbled with the old key. The door creaked open, revealing the stale, musty air inside. The interior of the cabin was exactly as I remembered. Wooden beams, old furniture, and shelves lined with trinkets and knickknacks my grandmother had collected over the years. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs hung in the corners. I set my bags down and decided to get started the next morning. For now, I wanted to get the generator running and settle in for the night. After some struggle, the generator sputtered to life, and a dim light flickered through the cabin. I rummaged through the cupboards, finding canned food that must have been years old. I wasn't hungry anyway, so I settled for some water and a quick look around. The living room had a large stone fireplace, its mantel adorned with old photographs. I picked up one of them, a picture of my grandmother holding me as a baby. She looked different in the photo, younger, happier. As I stared at her smiling face, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the cabin was wrong, something I hadn't noticed when I was a kid. I wandered into the hallway, the wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. At the end of the hall was a door I didn't remember, half hidden behind a dusty tapestry. I stared at it for a moment, confused. I had spent so many summers here. How could I not have known there was a room there? Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled the tapestry aside. The door was old, the wood weathered and splintered. I hesitated for a moment, then reached for the handle. It turned easily, and the door creaked open, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. I shined my flashlight into the stairwell, revealing narrow steps covered in dust. I had no recollection of a basement, and I couldn't understand why my grandmother had never mentioned it. The air from below was colder, carrying a faint, damp smell. Against my better judgment, I began to descend. The basement was unlike the rest of the cabin. The walls were made of stone, damp and cold to the touch. Shelves lined the walls, filled with strange objects, old jars with murky contents, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, and what looked like crude, handmade dolls with button eyes and straw bodies. In the center of the room stood a large wooden table, its surface scratched and worn. On the table lay an old leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age. I reached out and opened it, flipping through the brittle pages. The writing inside was in my grandmother's handwriting, but the words made no sense. They weren't in English, or in any language I recognized. There were diagrams too, strange symbols and shapes, some of them resembling the objects on the shelves. As I turned the pages, I found a passage in English scrawled hastily in the margins. Never let it out, never open the door. My heart pounded in my chest. What door? The room was small, and there was no other door except the one I had come through. I backed away from the table, my skin crawling with a sense of wrongness. I needed to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, my flashlight beam fell on something I hadn't noticed before. Another door, set into the far wall. It was smaller than the first, almost hidden in the shadows. A chill ran down my spine as I approached it, the words from the book echoing in my mind. Never open the door. I stood in front of it, my hand hovering over the cold iron handle. Everything inside me screamed to leave, to get out of the cabin and never come back. But something else, a deeper, darker curiosity, urged me forward. I had to know. I gripped the handle and pulled. The door groaned open, revealing a small, narrow room. The air inside was colder, thick with an almost metallic smell. In the center of the room was a large, ornate box, its surface covered in the same strange symbols from the book. The lid was slightly ajar. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. My mind was telling me to stop, to leave, but my body moved on its own, drawn to the box. I reached out and lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of old, yellowed cloth. I carefully unwrapped it, my hands trembling. What I found beneath the cloth made my blood run cold. It was a human skull, its eye sockets hollow and empty. But this wasn't just any skull. Carved into the bone were the same strange symbols I had seen in the book, deep grooves etched into the surface. As I stared at it, I felt a presence, something watching me, waiting. A sound behind me made me spin around. The basement door, the one I had come through, was now closed. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath forming in the air. The light from my flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. I heard a soft, raspy whisper coming from somewhere behind me. My heart raced as I turned, trying to find the source, but the room was pitch black. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, filling my ears with words I couldn't understand. I backed up, bumping into the table, the skull still clutched in my hand. The whispering stopped suddenly, replaced by a deafening silence. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, slowly, the door behind me creaked open. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I dropped the skull and bolted for the stairs, my legs shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers followed me, growing louder as I climbed. I could feel something behind me, something cold and angry, but I didn't dare turn around. I burst through the door into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. The whispers stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. I could feel the weight of the cabin pressing down on me, the air thick with the sense that something had been let loose, something that should have stayed buried. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the cabin, not stopping until I was safely in my car, the engine roaring to life. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing on the porch, watching me. But there was nothing, just the dark outline of the cabin, fading into the trees. I never went back. I couldn't. Whatever I had found in that basement, whatever secret my grandmother had been keeping, it was too much. The cabin still stands, empty and forgotten, but I know that something waits inside, hidden behind that door, waiting for someone else to find it. And this time, I know it won't let them leave. When David passed away, it left a hole in my life I couldn't fill. He had been my closest friend for years, more like a brother than anything else. His death was sudden. No one saw it coming. The official cause was a heart attack, but something about it didn't sit right with me. David had always been in good health, and the weeks leading up to his death had been strange. He had grown distant, avoiding calls and texts, and when we did talk, he sounded distracted, on edge. After the funeral, his family handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note from David and a single key, cold and heavy in my hand. "Go to the cabin," the note said. "You'll understand." The cabin in the woods had been David's retreat, a place he would disappear to when he needed to clear his mind. He rarely talked about what he did there, and I had only been up there a couple of times years ago. But if David left me the key, it meant he wanted me to go, to find something. I couldn't ignore it. A week later, I packed my car and headed out to the cabin. The drive took longer than I remembered, winding through dense, remote forest. The trees pressed in on either side of the narrow dirt road, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. It felt like the world was closing in, the sunlight dimming the deeper I went into the woods. When I finally arrived, the cabin stood there, looking just as I remembered it, small, weathered, isolated. But there was something off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The air around the place was still, unnaturally so. No birds, no wind, just silence. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel underfoot breaking the eerie quiet. The key felt heavy in my pocket as I approached the door. I hesitated for a moment, looking at the windows. They were dark, empty, like the place hadn't seen life in years. But David had been here recently. His truck had been parked out front when they found him. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was cold, colder than it should have been for this time of year. The fireplace was empty, and a layer of dust coated the floor and furniture. I called out, half expecting some kind of answer, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. I moved through the small living area, taking in the familiar surroundings, an old couch, a battered table, and shelves filled with books and random knickknacks. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing gave me any sense of what David wanted me to find. But then I noticed the journal on the coffee table, its leather cover cracked and worn. It wasn't there the last time I had been up here. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. It was David's handwriting, but the entries were erratic, scrawled in a way that didn't seem like him at all. The first few pages were normal, fishing trips, repairs to the cabin, but then the tone shifted. "Something's wrong here," one entry read. "I hear it at night. I don't know what it is, but it's getting closer." I kept reading, my heart racing. The entries became more frantic, talking about shadows and voices. David wrote about waking up in the middle of the night, feeling watched, but finding no one there. He talked about something outside the cabin, in the woods, watching him, but never revealing itself. "I can't leave," one of the last entries said. "It won't let me." The final entry was unfinished. The words trailed off as if he had stopped mid-sentence. I put the journal down, my hands shaking. The sense of wrongness in the cabin was overwhelming now, like the walls themselves were pressing in. I needed to get out, to breathe. I stepped outside, but the air didn't feel any lighter. The woods, once peaceful, now felt menacing. The trees loomed over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, just like David had written. The silence was absolute, not a single sound coming from the forest around me. I walked to the edge of the clearing, looking into the dense line of trees. Something moved. Just for a second, I saw it, a shape, dark and quick, slipping between the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. My skin prickled, and I took a step back, but my eyes kept searching the forest for any sign of movement. Another rustle. Closer this time. I backed away toward the cabin, my pulse hammering in my ears. I could feel something out there, something watching me, just like David had described. I turned and hurried back inside, slamming the door behind me. The sudden noise echoed through the cabin, but the silence quickly swallowed it up again. I locked the door and tried to calm down, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. David's journal wasn't the ramblings of a man losing his mind. He had been scared, and now I understood why. As the hours passed, the light outside faded, and the cabin grew darker. I didn't dare go outside again. Instead, I lit a fire in the hearth, hoping to chase away the cold, the darkness. But even the warmth of the fire didn't help. It felt like the shadows in the corners of the room were growing, stretching towards me. I sat on the couch, staring into the flames, trying to make sense of everything. But then, I heard it. A sound from outside, faint but unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps on the gravel. I froze, listening. The steps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the door. I waited, my breath held, my eyes locked on the door. A soft knock echoed through the cabin. My heart pounded. I didn't move. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I stood, my legs shaking, and crept towards the door. I peered through the small window, but the porch was empty. No one was there. Another knock, this time from the back of the cabin. I turned, my mind racing. Someone, or something, was toying with me. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and edged toward the back door. I didn't want to open it, but I had to know. I reached for the door handle, but before I could turn it, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I could feel it. Something was waiting just outside. Suddenly, a loud thud hit the roof, and the cabin shook. I stumbled back, the poker clattering to the floor. The thudding continued, like heavy footsteps running across the roof, circling above me. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the keys and rushed for the front door, but as I unlocked it, the thudding stopped. I hesitated, my hand on the knob, and then in the quiet, I heard a voice. It was David's voice, coming from outside. "Let me in." I froze. It wasn't possible. David was dead. I knew that. But the voice, it sounded exactly like him. "Please let me in," the voice repeated, closer now, right on the other side of the door. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The doorknob rattled as if something on the other side was trying to open it. The fire flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift, stretching towards me. The air grew colder, and the walls felt like they were closing in. I didn't stay to find out what was on the other side. I bolted out the back door, running blindly into the woods, leaving the cabin behind. I don't know what I saw or what I heard, but I know it wasn't David. Whatever secrets he had uncovered in that cabin, they should have stayed buried.